has a Ph.D. in molecular biology. She's a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Additionally, her careers included posts in the executive and legislative branches of the government, in management and research, in the nonprofit arena, and in journalism and science policy. And then I just kept scanning down, and she's publishing books and authoring things, and I thought in her spare time she does underwater basket weaving, which she doesn't, but I thought, what doesn't Jessica do? So I think you're getting all nice and mic'd up, but I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. The first question that I assume that many of you are asking is, what on earth is she doing here? And the answer is that for all of those who, probably most of you or many of you, who know Larry Gold know that beneath that apparently mild exterior is someone who it's very hard to say no to. I said it many times over the last year. You can say it, it just doesn't have much impact. So just to be clear, I don't know the answer to this question either, but I will do my best to make it interesting. I'm not going to talk about current foreign policy, or at least if you can call it policy, because if you are at all like me, you are finding that you are spending more and more time, wasting more and more time, obsessed by and fixated on the day-to-day craziness and at the expense of real issues. There is a very big issue in foreign policy that predates this administration, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. And it has to do with the fact that for decades now, American foreign policy has circled around three different worldviews without reaching any sense of convergence on any one of them. And they are, all three of them, becoming more and more disconnected to present realities. The three worldviews are, first, the neoconservative view, the neocon view. Neocons believe that the United States should be the global policeman. They believe strongly in unilateral action. They believe that US foreign policy should be based not just on other countries' foreign policies, but on their internal policies. They believe that those internal policies should reflect what they believe to be universal values, or what should be universally held values of freedom, religious tolerance, human rights, et cetera. And they have a pretty strong disdain for international institutions and international agreements. They generally believe that those are good for controlling the behavior or guiding the behavior of good guys, and the bad guys ignore them, and good guys don't need them. So that kind of defines the neocon view of how foreign policy should be framed. The realists have a much narrower focus. They believe that the US should base its foreign policy on concrete, hard-headed, it's realist interests. They put values at a much, much lower level. And they believe policy focus should be on the other great powers. They don't take a global view. They're looking at the great powers. And then there are the liberal internationalists who believe that security is increasingly rooted in international cooperation and in alliances and in the rule of law embodied in international institutions. Some liberal internationalists are aggressively interventionist. They split, for example, over the question of whether we should intervene actively in Syria in 2013 and 14, when that was a real possibility. They split over whether US should have intervened actively in Libya or a few years earlier. So there are really kind of two wings of liberal internationalists, those who are, want the US to intervene in pursuit of its values and interests widely, and those who are much more skeptical about the value of those interventions. All three of these worldviews are rooted in two underlying narratives that are now very, very old. The first is, and I'm sure you heard this in these descriptions, the first is the tension that is at the heart of American foreign policy for 150 years, really more, between interests and values, between Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Henry Kissinger has beautifully called it congenital ambivalence, and that is exactly what it is. It is an ambivalence that we have been unable to get rid of through our modern history. And that seesawing debate continues. The other narrative, which is a bit more recent, but still now 70 years old, is whether the US is destined to be, should be, needs to be the global hegemon. And that narrative begins in the unique moment at the end of World War II, when we were the only economy that was left undamaged. And the war had been very good to us. World War II took us out of the Depression, gave us a massive domestic manufacturing capability that we hadn't had, took us from having the world's 17th largest military at the beginning of the war, right behind Portugal, right ahead of Romania, to being by far the #1 priority of military. And so we came out of the war the only undamaged economy, and one with a roaring economy. And in that unique moment was born the US role of global leadership, and indeed of hegemony. It reappeared at the end, briefly, at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed almost overnight. China had not yet begun the steep part of its rise, and we had what the Neocons called the unipolar moment, when Frank Fukuyama, as many of you remember, declared the end of history, that democracy and liberal capitalism had proven to be the only way to successfully run a national government, and that would be the forward trajectory of international history. Well, the neocons really got carried away in those few years. There was talk about a weird oxymoron called democratic imperialism. But the United States, we are not imperialist at heart, and this did lead us into the war in Iraq, but it was a brief moment. Nonetheless, this neocon, realist, liberal interventionist debate continues. It's the basis of libraries of work, many of them great works, but with remarkably now little connection to the conditions in the world that gave them birth, and a world that is now totally transformed from those conditions. And so it's really no wonder that thinking about foreign policy has become really stale and unproductive and circular and depressing for those who practice it. So the question is, how do we divorce ourselves from this long-standing way of looking at the world? And how do we get out of trying to force policy into the framework of an increasingly irrelevant past? Wrenching yourself away from the way of framing issues that you've had since birth, or as a field for now 120 years, is tough. I think the only way to do it or it's the only way I can think of, is to drop ideology, drop the isms entirely if one can, and instead take an empirical approach by also dropping the past and even the present, which is too highly influenced by the past, and look ahead and ask, what do we believe to be the conditions, can we infer will be the conditions that will drive geopolitics over the next 3-4 decades? And then ask, okay, if that's what we think the world will look like, what kind of policy fits those conditions instead of these conditions? And the difficulty with doing, so you do in effect a sort of a regression analysis on foreign policy, except without real data. The difficulty is, well, there's several. Probably everybody in the room is thinking about the obvious one, which is the difficulties of doing prediction on this scale, especially when you're dealing with rapid scientific and technological change, which we are. My favorite example is Charles Darwin, who spent a lifetime studying how things change over time and wrote in his autobiography, "I rejoice that I have avoided controversy." And more recently, the National Academy of Engineering did a study of the potential applications of the brand new Xerox machine when it came out in the early 50s, and came to the conclusion that the national market for Xerox machines was 5,000 units. There are probably 5,000 Xerox machines within a 10-block radius of the National Academy of Engineering. But I could give you lots of terrific examples of how laughable most attempts at prediction are. And we all, I think, agree that today's rate of technological change dwarfs that of the 1950s or the 1880s. So that's one problem. Second problem is that geopolitical turning points are really just about impossible to predict, even when they're happening. I mean, American intelligence and diplomats who were watching it happen up close couldn't see the collapse of the Soviet Union until way late in the process of the collapse. I do think, though, so I'm very aware of what the problems are. But I do think it's possible to identify at least the pathways of change and the areas that are going to be most influential. To take an example, we don't need to try to predict the price of oil. Can't predict, even though it's the world's largest traded commodity and it ought to be a super tanker that's really hard to change, you can't predict it 10 years, 5 years, 6 months. But you can look at the massive geochemical and chemical changes, geological and chemical changes that are transforming the oil industry. You can look at the new connections that are emerging between the markets of different fossil fuels. You can look at the rate and scope of actions that are being taken to deal with climate change. And you can put all those together and get at least a picture, I believe, of the way in which the global energy landscape is being scrambled. And from those, I think you can begin to tease out the geopolitical consequences from the new opportunities for poor but sunny countries to the very unsettled future for the established petrostates who have built economies on one source of income. And finally, these predictions don't have to be right to be useful. Because I think that, I mean, events and wiser heads will correct some of them. But at least by attempting this exercise, we can start new thinking, which over time should lead to a policy that's designed to meet the conditions of the 21st century rather than one that was designed to meet the conditions of the 19th and 20th century. So what I'd like to do is to share with you my tentative first list of what those major areas are. They require, in order to tease out the specific geopolitical consequences and the answers for US foreign policy, I'm telling you right now in advance, I don't know yet. This is a work in progress and early stages of. But let me share with you the list. I want to start by saying the most important threat that this country faces is not external, it's internal. And unless we can fix our domestic political malfunction, we have no freedom of choice. And therefore no ability to agree on anything or ability to execute on any agreed policy. Issues that should not be political become so, and this is, without any question, our greatest threat. So having said that, let me talk about the external threats. These are not actually in order of threat, but because they're all huge. The first, I think, is the steadily darkening world of cyberspace. There are a whole number of concerns here. The greatly added power of the weak, the whole new realms of asymmetric warfare, the migration of warfare from military to military to civilian, that is to disrupt civilian societies. The fact that a set of technologies, social media, that were expected to bring people together, at least so far appear much better at dividing people. They have weakened tolerance for diversity. They have strengthened tribalism. And they appear so far to have selectively weakened democratic governance versus autocratic governance. They have, I believe, made it selectively more difficult to govern democracies. You may remember 15, 20 years ago, it was basically universally believed that the internet was going to be a huge challenge for China, that China would either have to open up or consign itself to slow economic growth. And in fact, many people, maybe most, believed that it wasn't even a choice at all because there would be no way to close itself off from the internet's opening of information to all. Well, it turned out that the Chinese were very effective at building a firewall and at controlling access to technology, and that right now, I think you could argue that the firewall is an asset, an economic asset as well as a political one, rather than a cost. So expectations are drastically different. The cyberspace gives, many of these problems could be addressed by developing global norms, global institutions, but because they engage both the government and the private sector, as well as civic sector, doing so is massively difficult, massively more difficult than any other international regime we have tried to build. Secondly, and I would put this, it's obviously related but separate, is the advent of AI, ML, massive data analytics, robotics, and someday quantum computing. We have seen the enormous political impacts of the massive job losses and blue-collar losses from manufacturing technologies. What will happen when you have job losses among white-collar workers on an equal or greater scale from these technologies? How do you build a society with that. A couple of years ago, a group that should not be confused with Cambridge Analytica, Oxford Analytica, which is a serious research firm, concluded in a study that got massive attention that 45% of American jobs were vulnerable to automation. Subsequent studies have put the number much lower, but it's a huge number. And how one governs a country or an international society under that kind of pressure, I don't think we even begin to know. It also raises the specter of a spreading populism from people who've seen their governments fail them. And we are clearly already seeing it, what happens if and as it spreads. This is going to be a huge driver of international insecurity and of what the world will look like. Third is going to be the disruption of the energy sector. Fossil fuels have been a leading determinant of power in the international system for decades. And the fate of today's oil and gas superpowers is very much in question. There's going to be rapid change in really all the key parameters of how power spreads from the accidents of those initial oil and gas and at one time coal resources. I briefly described some of them, so I won't repeat them here, but there are huge changes underway, and some of which will be, I think, positive. Fourth is Russia. Russia, in a very short space of time, it seems, as somebody who deals with it directly, it seems almost overnight that it has gone from a partner at the end of in the early years after the end of the Cold War to an adversary, to an active threat. In the early 90s, fewer than 10% of Russians had negative views of Americans. Today, the number is slightly over 80%. So this is not just Putin. It's pretty clear now that we are dealing with a determined enemy, and that enemy has a clear goal, which is to weaken the United States in two ways: domestically, in our ability to preserve a coherent polity, and internationally in our ability to frame and execute an international activity, much less leadership. The more you look closely at what Russia has done and is doing, the more those two aims become clear, and I very much hope that that nobody will forget that underneath all the craziness about the Mueller investigation is a vastly important issue. And somehow we have to retrieve for most of the country a recognition of what that issue is and what that threat is. Enough said about Russia. China, we're at a unique moment for China and for the US. The US appears to be seeking to find a way to step back, to play a smaller international role, and China is very clearly at this moment looking to take a much larger one. And those two changes have come at the same moment. In his speech in January, a few months ago at the Communist Party Congress, President Xi made this very explicit. The guiding principle of Chinese foreign policy was articulated by Deng Xiaoping in the early 90s. It was a little dictum: hide your strength, bide your time. Chinese foreign policy has been guided by that phrase for the last 20 years. President Xi said in that 3-hour speech, buried in it were these words: "It is time for us to take center stage in the world. China offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence." A clear statement of, we are a different option from the United States. We are setting now a goal of becoming a global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence by 2050. The Chinese nation now has an entirely new posture, and we are, as I said, entering a new era. That's about as far as you can go from hide your strength, bide your time, to a new statement. And as I said, we are moving in the opposite direction. This is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And it's right now in a confusion would be the best way to describe, I think, its terms. We have to find, we and the Chinese together, a modus vivendi. The planet is not large enough to go on without one, I think. And finally, I would put the question of the future of globalization, and the question of whether we have entered a period where it is simply stalled or whether it's beginning to reverse. And we've gone through several decades where foreign direct investment was twice as large as international trade, and international trade was twice as large as the growth in GDP. All of that is gone right now. Trade is about the size of GDP. Foreign direct investment is way down. But I'd say the jury's out on whether it's a stall or a reversal, an unwinding. But certainly the future of international law and cooperation through the UN system and through other international agreements depends, or is going to be heavily influenced by the future of globalization. And then finally, let me just mention that you have to put on this list surprise. I used to testify a lot about climate change, and when I would talk about surprise, never failed, some senator would say, like what? And I'd say, well, but I'll give you a couple of guesses. The future of India, to me, is a real question mark. India needs to create 1 million jobs a month. It creates now 600,000 jobs a year. So question, even with healthy growth, how long does India, in today's pressure cooker world, stay? That's one worry in my mind. A global pandemic is, I think, maybe a question of when, not if, although its size is very much in question. But the effects on global GDP from a big pandemic would be very sizable. You know, it's just good to remember the Spanish flu, which was not that long ago, killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. So there's my list of what I think we're going to be dealing with in the world to come, and the way I think that we will hope try to begin to think differently about our role in the world. So we design a foreign policy that is more aligned with the world we're actually going to face. Happy to take questions about today's issues or these questions as you wish.
I just wanted to just ask sort of a general question. We keep backsliding, it seems, at a time when obviously we need to be moving forward. Is it because things haven't gotten bad enough? Why do we keep slipping like we just did in our most recent election? But also it's been happening in a lot of other ways. And you look back at the past, you see McCarthy, you see, all these strange things, Wallace, then you see, Trump. Why do we keep backsliding? Is it because it hasn't gotten bad enough or something else?
Well, that's it's an impossible question to answer in any kind of short period of time. Societies have short memories. They have very short memories. And it appears this one does in particular need to be reminded over and over again of lessons that we apparently already learned once. Do you want me to pick people or what? Go ahead.
I wonder, one thing I sort of expected to hear, but I didn't, was economic inequities across the world in a global situation. Could you comment?
Yeah. It may belong on this list, the growth of inequality. What I don't know is, it is clearly growing outside the US dramatically as well. What I don't know is how much it is a function of the conditions of globalization and it also, I guess in my brain, it also, I think about it in what I started by saying, which has to do with domestic dysfunction. The top 1% of wealth in Europe is the top 1% of people hold the amount of wealth equal to 55% of the population. In the United States, the top 1% holds 88%. Right? We have become, in all of our lifetimes, right? We were the country that had that let you be born poor and die rich. We are no longer that country. And so you're perfectly right to, I haven't worked out for myself whether it's a secondary function or a primary one is, I guess, the fair answer.
Let him guess.
So I'm a little bit confused by the talk because the first part laid out three different philosophies that, in my naivete, seems to cover the entire universe of possibilities. And the second part, you talked about problems, but I didn't see an application of philosophy to problem. And I'm wondering, so any one of those, neocon, realist, or liberal interventionist, could apply their philosophy to those problems and say, well, this is the solution. How is it that you're viewing how we need to change our thinking around these?
I didn't make the nub of my talk clear. I think that those three ways of thinking about US foreign policy have reached a dead end. You have to kind of be a practitioner to know how terrible, repetitive, unhelpful, circular the debate has been over the last several decades. You can see particular mistakes, right? It was the neocon worldview that took us into Iraq. Clearly the biggest mistake that we made until 2 weeks ago. But it doesn't lead anywhere. It's a dead end, right? So the only way I can see that we get out of it is to just forget we ever heard those words, and try, and as I say, try to paint a picture, which I've only given you a sketch and not the way those are filled in. But I think as you then explore these 6 areas, we can define from them the challenges that we will deal with. And out of that will come for answers to the question, for example, how much international leadership do we need to exercise? I mean, that's one of the core questions that differs among these, right, in these 3 worldviews, which we can't answer with any consensus in this country anymore. Did the apparent success, did the world actually build something important in the 50 years following World War II, when the UN system and a whole number of international regimes were created? Or was it an artifact of American leadership? Did it all depend on American leadership? Because when the US started to step back, it seemed to start to crumble. These are the questions we can, I think, begin to get answers from by looking at what are the, in hard-headed way, what are the problems we're going to face, and therefore what do we, what are we obliged to do for our own interests? Is that clear? Why don't you just pass the...
How about you pick?
I'd like to continue on that question a little bit. The challenge that I see is that the people today and those who are presently making the decisions are in one form or another made up of one of these 3 disciplines. And how do you change those behavior patterns and their particular interests in order to surrender now to a new approach that may or may not take in some of those old disciplines, but could look at it new?
Yeah,
When you if I might just finish one point as an example. When you talk about the Iraq War and the neocons being completely wrong, the neocons would tell you that they don't see it that way. If you talk to John Bolton today, he still sees it the same way that he was right. So I have difficulty not with where you want to go, but how you get there when those who are in power are still making those decisions.
Well, there are 2 separate issues here. What I've sketched out is a thinking agenda, not a governing agenda yet. And before it became a governing agenda, it would need to be developed and then reach some kind of international support before you could actually successfully govern on it. About the only positive thing that I can think of to say about Donald Trump is he is none of these things. He is not captured by them because he doesn't know enough to live in one of these boxes in a consistent way. And Bolton is really an outlier even among neocons. There are very few of them, very, very few, who still believe that the invasion of Iraq was a good idea. Tiny number. So this administration, truly, I mean, it's funny, but it isn't. They are not following anything that you could describe as a coherent policy. I mean, it just isn't. But so what I'm talking about is something that's going to take some time to do. But I think the longer we continue with these 3 worldviews that are based in a 19th and early 20th century world, the worse it's going to be for us. Yes.
I think we've only got time for maybe one more. And I wondered, we haven't been to the back of the room, so I was curious whether there was anybody in the way high. I'm trying to be equitable, probably going to fail miserably.
Sometimes an advantage sitting in the back. So I come from a country that started to drive forward by looking in the rearview mirror. So I really like the way you laid out your talk. But surely it's impossible to address these questions without asking, who are we and what do we stand for? And that's what the Brexit question called in Britain. Is it impossible to wrestle with that here?
I think that what do we stand for is so wrapped up in this, in the question of therefore what role do we want to play in the world, that it's circular. We can't, we have, it is, that's why I quoted that Kissinger comment, congenital ambivalence. It is a condition that we have never been able to answer for ourselves directly, I think, who we are. Or at least it is so kind of infected with these three well-developed narratives about what role the US should play that you can't see it anymore. Again, except oddly enough for this administration where nothing hangs together. And so, but that's no way to run a foreign policy either. It's just, so I think it's unlikely that we are able to, although I see the importance of the question you're asking, to hit that one head on in this country. I don't think we can find an answer. We will get a mix, a mishmash of the shining city on the hill and, you know, our ancient history, our old history, and a lot of myths about how great we are, and a lot of confusion about how much we can in fact do in the world. All of which we've seen, you know, and now we're back to sort of how great we are. Make America great again. We have an exaggerated notion of how much we can now, in fact, affect, that is heavily based on what the world looked like in 1948. And that makes it terribly difficult, for example, to confront a new rising great power in China. And I'm sorry, this is such a long answer, but I think we never get a clear answer or an answer that commands any kind of national consensus out of trying to ask directly, who are we? Or who should we be? The past plays too much of a role in that, and the world is really different.
Jessica, thank you so much.